"There is a woman at the piano," said Lord Ashworth, setting down his champagne with the mild disappointment of a man who has found a flaw in an otherwise adequate arrangement, who does not appear to understand that this is a reception, not a rehearsal room. Penelope Ashworth heard him from 3 feet away. She heard him because she always heard everything, and because the drawing room of Hartley House had been laid out with the particular acoustical generosity of rooms designed to impress rather than to contain sound. She heard him, and she continued to play. The reception was, by any fair accounting, magnificent. Lord Ashworth's wife had spent 6 weeks on the floral arrangements alone, and the effect was a kind of calculated paradise. Garlands of white roses and hothouse lilies trailing from the gallery rails, every surface polished to an almost aggressive shine, 200 candles burning in the 3 chandeliers that Edmund, the 9th Duke of Claremore, had not yet arrived to stand beneath. The women wore their best silks, the men wore their best confidence. The orchestra in the East Corridor was playing something sprightly and entirely inaudible beneath the noise of everyone performing their enjoyment of it. And at the edge of all that glittering, orchestrated excess, seated at the old pianoforte near the north window, that no one had troubled to have tuned since 1809, was Penelope. She was not the music for the evening. She was not in any formal sense a guest. She was Lord Ashworth's niece by a chain of inheritance sufficiently complicated that most people at this party could not have explained it, and she had been given the task of ensuring that the supper arrangements remained coherent through the evening's first hour, that the floral garlands on the west staircase did not sag further than they already had, and that someone was playing the pianoforte before the orchestra arrived to spare the room from silence. She had done all 3 things. The garlands were repinned. The supper cards were reordered after the head footman had muddled the placement. The piano, temperamental as it was producing something almost presentable under her hands. She was wearing a gown the color of pewter. It was 2 seasons old. She knew exactly how old it was because she had mended the hem herself in the autumn of 1814, and it was now the spring of 1816. And she had not had occasion to acquire another. Lord Ashworth had already moved on, his mild disapproval folded back into the evening's general satisfaction, when the doors opened and the room changed. It was not that Edmund Cavendish, 9th Duke of Claremore, was a spectacular-looking man, though he was tall enough and dark enough to hold a room's attention without effort. It was something else. The particular quality of a person who moves through social gatherings the way a well-built bridge moves through weather, present, structural, unmoved. He had 2 men at his shoulder who were talking. He was not. His eyes moved across the room with the systematic attention of someone who has arrived not to be entertained, but to confirm what he already suspects. They crossed the orchestra corridor, the flower arrangements, the assembled faces of people who wanted something from him. They reached the north window, the old pianoforte, the woman in pewter sitting at it with her spine very straight, and they stopped. He did not look at Penelope the way the room looked at her, which was to say he did not decline to look at her. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he was not expecting to find, which is a different thing entirely from admiration. It was the measuring attention of a person who has just identified something he does not yet understand. Penelope's hands did not falter on the keys. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. She finished the movement, lifted her hands from the piano, and turned to find the card she had been given for the supper arrangements, because the evening had not paused for the Duke of Claremore's arrival, and the 3rd course required someone to confirm that the pheasant had in fact arrived from the kitchen, which it had not, the last time anyone had checked. Penelope Ashworth had been managing things no one noticed for 11 years. It had begun, as most of her difficulties had begun, with the death of her father. Arthur Ashworth had been a man of modest means and immodest optimism, a second son who had married for love and thereafter conducted his life as though love were a sufficient foundation for every other arrangement. It had not been. When he died in the winter of 1805, Penelope was 17 years old. Her mother was already 3 years gone, and the estate at Merrow, 22 tenant farms, a working mill, and a household of 9, passed into the management of her father's elder brother, Lord Ashworth of Hartley House, who was in London and intended to remain there. Lord Ashworth had dispatched his solicitor, a Mr. Jennings, to Merrow within the month. Mr. Jennings had looked at the accounts, looked at Penelope, and delivered his assessment. The estate was in tolerable condition. Lord Ashworth would require a quarterly report, and it would be simplest if someone on site could manage the day-to-day administration until a proper steward could be found. The proper steward had never been found, because the quarterly reports Penelope began sending were so precise, so organized, and so effective at identifying problems before they became crises, that Mr. Jennings, who was not without professional conscience, had written to Lord Ashworth to note that the arrangement appeared to be functioning. The arrangement had continued to function for 6 years. In that time, Penelope had negotiated 3 separate creditor agreements on the estate's behalf, recovering from the obligations her father had left in a state of optimistic disorganization. She had renegotiated the mill lease, which had been running at a loss of £40 annually on terms her father had agreed to without reading the 3rd clause. She had identified that the eastern farms were being underassessed by the surveyor, a discrepancy of 17 acres across 4 parcels, and had documented the error so completely, with measurements taken herself over the course of a single August week, that the surveyor had corrected his assessment without dispute. She had managed 1 outbreak of rot in the granary, 2 difficult winters, and a summer flood that had taken the lower mill race and required her to coordinate 3 weeks of repairs, using workmen she had sourced, scheduled, and paid from the estate's emergency reserves. She had done all of it from a small writing desk in the morning room at Merrow, with no title, no acknowledgement, and a household allowance that Lord Ashworth had quietly reduced from its original £40 per quarter to 32, on the grounds that the estate was running more efficiently and therefore required less. She had been 19 years old when she negotiated the first creditor agreement, sitting across from a wool merchant from Guildford who had expected her uncle and received instead a young woman with a ledger, a list of figures, and a counter-proposal she had spent 4 days preparing. The merchant had taken it. There had been one moment, in the 4th year of managing Merrow, when she had sat at the writing desk on a February morning, with the accounts spread before her, and understood with complete clarity that she could simply stop. She could write to Lord Ashworth and say that the arrangement had grown beyond what she could manage, which would have been true in the way that any honest account of labor is true when the labor has been made deliberately invisible. She could step away, and the estate would hire a steward, and the steward would receive credit for work she had already built. She had sat with that knowledge for approximately 12 minutes. Then she had picked up her pen and returned to the accounts, because she was not going to become less than she was in order to make anyone else more comfortable with what she could do. That was the decision, made once, in February, in the 4th year. She did not need to make it again. In 1811, Lord Ashworth had written to say that he required her presence in London. Merrow was to be transferred to a proper estate manager at last, a Mr. Carver, who arrived with excellent references and an immediate incomprehension of the filing system Penelope had developed over 6 years. She had spent 3 weeks training him, producing annotated summaries of every active agreement, every tenant arrangement, every ongoing maintenance obligation. Mr. Carver had accepted these documents with the brisk confidence of a man who intends to make improvements, and Penelope had traveled to London with 1 trunk and the clear understanding that she was being recalled not because she was wanted, but because she was no longer being used where she had been placed. In London, the invisible labor had simply changed shape. She was now the person who managed Lord Ashworth's household accounts when the housekeeper was ill. She was the person who organized his correspondence when his secretary was overcommitted. She was the person who knew where the spare keys were kept, which creditors required prompt attention, and how to instruct the kitchen when his wife was indisposed. She was the person who sat at an untuned pianoforte at a reception for a duke and made sure the supper arrangements were coherent, because someone had to, and it was always Penelope. She had learned to be very good at being in a room without being seen. The person being invisible in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. She had also, in the 5th year at Marrow, learned that she had been seen once, precisely once, before. A retired clergyman named Mr. Hargreave, who had been a friend of her father's, and who visited Marrow occasionally, had come in the autumn of 1810 to find her at the writing desk with the mill repair accounts. He had looked at what she was doing for a long moment, and then he had said quietly, "Your father would be surprised and your father would be proud, which are two different things that sometimes come together." She had not answered. She had pressed one hand briefly against the desk's edge and returned to her column of figures. But she had held that sentence for 6 years, like a coin kept in a coat pocket, just there, solid, not for spending. Edmund Cavendish had been investigating Penelope Ashworth for 6 weeks before he spoke to her. This was not the romantic impulse it might appear to be. He had commissioned an investigator, his family's solicitor, one Mr. Patrick Savage, who had served the Claremore estate for 31 years and was constitutionally incapable of a careless report, in connection with a specific problem. The Claremore estate, which encompassed 14 farms, 3 villages, and a wool processing arrangement that had been losing £200 annually since 1812, required a new system of accounts management. Edmund had dismissed 2 stewards in the previous 4 years, not for incompetence exactly, but for the particular variety of competence that produces ordered-looking books containing hidden disorder. He needed something specific, and he did not know yet what to call it. Mr. Savage's report on the candidates Edmund had asked him to assess had been thorough, as all his reports were, and it had contained a footnote. Not a section, a footnote, 8 lines, at the bottom of the 2nd page of a detailed accounting of a Mr. Frederick Hartley, who was the formally recommended candidate. The footnote noted that in the course of reviewing the Marrow estate records for context, Mr. Savage had found a 6-year administrative record of unusual quality. The creditor agreements were documented with a precision he had rarely seen from professional solicitors. The tenant arrangements showed evidence of a systematic approach to assessment he could not identify as having come from any established training. The mill lease renegotiation had recovered the estate from a loss position through the identification of a clause the original surveyor had not contested. He had traced the author of this record because his professional instincts had required it of him, and the author was Lord Ashworth's niece, currently residing in Hartley House, London, in an unspecified domestic capacity. Edmund had read the footnote 3 times. Then he had asked Mr. Savage to prepare a separate report on Miss Penelope Ashworth. The separate report had taken 4 weeks, because Mr. Savage was thorough. It established that Penelope had managed Marrow from 1805 to 1811 with no professional credential, no formal appointment, and no payment beyond the household allowance. It documented that the estate, which had carried debts of approximately £800 at her father's death, had reduced those debts to £140 by 1811 through a series of negotiations Penelope had conducted herself. It included, at the end, Mr. Savage's private editorial note, which he was generally too professional to provide, but which he offered in this case. "I have reviewed the working documents. They are not the work of an untrained mind in tolerable conditions. They are the work of a systematically excellent mind in a structural situation that made systematic excellence essentially invisible." Edmund had put the report down. He had gone to his study window and stood there for a while, looking at nothing in particular. He was a man who made decisions by gathering information until the decision became obvious, and it had become obvious. He had also done one other thing. Before commissioning the investigator, he had attended a musical evening at a house in Mayfair, not the Hartley House reception that was later, at which a young woman in a gray-green gown had been playing an old Handel piece on a pianoforte that was somewhat out of tune, with the particular quality of attention that a musician brings to a difficult instrument, not fighting it, but working within its limitations with such precision that the limitations almost disappeared. He had stood in the doorway for 11 minutes. The woman had not seen him. She had finished the piece, consulted a small card she had beside her on the bench, risen, and gone to speak to someone about the arrangement of chairs for the supper, and her expression throughout had been the mild, focused expression of someone who is running a great many calculations simultaneously and finding all of them manageable. He had gone home, found his solicitor's report on his desk. It had arrived that morning, and read the footnote. He had attended the Hartley House reception because Lord Ashworth had invited him, and because Edmund made a habit of accepting invitations he might otherwise decline, when he had good reason to confirm something he already suspected. He had seen Penelope at the piano. He had noted that the supper arrangements were running coherently in a room where 200 people were creating the usual chaos of social obligation, and that the person moving quietly between the kitchen footman and the seating cards, consulting her small list, was the same woman who had been playing the piano. He had noted that no one in the room appeared to register any of this as work. He had made his decision on the night of Mr. Savage's footnote. The reception confirmed it. He found his opportunity at the supper. Not in the main room. He was careful not to make the approach where it could be publicly observed and misread, but in the narrow corridor near the kitchen passage, where Penelope had gone to confirm the pheasant's arrival, which had finally occurred at 9:15. "Miss Ashworth," he said. She turned with the particular composure of someone who has been surprised but declines to perform surprise. "Your Grace, I understand the supper arrangements have been managed this evening with some difficulty. The pheasant was late." She looked at him for a moment. It was a precise look, the kind that inventories without appearing to. "By 40 minutes, she said. "The kitchen had a staffing difficulty. I rescheduled the courses and moved the fish forward. The sequence held." "I thought so," he said. "I noticed the first course was served without the usual interval." He paused. Most people would not have noticed a problem had been solved, because it was solved before it became visible. That is, I think, your method. She did not answer immediately. She held the small card she had been consulting all evening. "Is there something I can help you with, Your Grace?" "Yes," he said. "I have a position I need to fill. I would like to discuss it with you, with Lord Ashworth's permission, at your earliest convenience. The details require some time to explain properly." He met her eyes. "You would find them, I believe, specific." She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. But she said she would receive him on Thursday, if Lord Ashworth permitted it, and she went back to her list. Lord Ashworth had not objected to the Duke of Claremor's request for a meeting with his niece, because one did not object when the Duke of Claremore made requests, and also because he could not quite fathom what the meeting was for, and preferred to learn afterward. The meeting took place in the morning room of Hartley House, with Lord Ashworth notionally present at a writing desk in the corner, from which he absented himself within 20 minutes to attend to correspondence elsewhere, because Edmund's offer was so straightforwardly practical that Lord Ashworth found he had no particular leverage point on which to rest his unease. Edmund had brought Mr. Savage, who produced, with the calm efficiency of long practice, the Claremore estate accounts for the previous 4 years and the 2 management reports he had prepared on the candidates who had not been selected. He then produced, with a slight pause that was his version of delicacy, a bound summary of the Marrow estate records, 1805 to 1811. Penelope looked at the Marrow summary for one moment without touching it. Then she looked at Edmund. "You had these compiled," she said. "Mr. Savage compiled them," Edmund said. "I asked him to trace the management history of the estate after he found a reference in another report. It was his assessment, not mine, that I then confirmed." "And what position," she said, "are you offering?" He told her. The Claremore estate required an estate administrator. The title had been the subject of some discussion because the role had previously been styled as steward, which was a word with associations that did not accurately describe what was needed. The administrator would have full authority over the accounts, the tenant farm negotiations, and the management of the wool processing arrangement. They would report to Edmund and to Mr. Savage. The salary was £350 annually, with the use of a cottage on the estate grounds and the full cooperation of the household staff. The position was, he noted, being offered to her specifically and not to any of the other candidates Mr. Savage had assessed. Penelope pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the table. Then she straightened in her chair and looked at Mr. Savage's summary of the Claremore accounts, which she had been reading while Edmund spoke, because she was the kind of person who could do both things at once. "Your wool processing loss," she said. "It is £200 annually. The records suggest it has been running at this level since 1812. Is the loss consistent across quarters, or does it cluster?" Mr. Savage blinked. "It clusters," he said. "First and third quarters." "Then it is not a systemic inefficiency," Penelope said. "It is a timing problem. The processing schedule is misaligned with the market. You are processing at the wrong point in the seasonal cycle and selling into a depressed price. A 4-week shift in the first quarter schedule and a renegotiation of the third quarter agreements would likely recover 160 of the £200 within one full year." She set the accounts down. "I would need to see the processing contracts and the market records for the past 6 years before I could put a number to it with precision, but that is my reading of what is here." Mr. Savage looked at Edmund with the mild expression of a man who has been professionally validated. "I would like until Monday to consider the offer," Penelope said to Edmund. "Of course," he said. She considered it for 2 days, not 4. Because she had been doing the calculation in her head since Thursday morning. The position was real. The salary was more than she had ever been paid for anything. The independence it represented was of a kind she had not allowed herself to want with any specificity, because specificity makes the absence of a thing heavier. On Saturday evening she wrote to Edmund to say she accepted, and on Sunday she told Lord Ashworth, who received the news with the expression of a man assembling a revised understanding of something he had not thought required revising. She arrived at Claremore in the 3rd week of April 1816, on a morning of thin spring sunshine, with one trunk and the annotated copy of the estate accounts Edmund had sent her in advance, which she had read 3 times and marked in several places. The estate was substantial and, in certain respects, troubled. It was also, she saw at once, beautiful in the quiet architectural way of very old things that have been maintained without being loved. The manor house's south face catching the light correctly, the farm buildings in solid repair, the grounds neither neglected nor particularly cared for, like a well-built structure whose occupant had not quite moved in. The housekeeper, a compact woman of 50 named Mrs. Laura Finn, met her at the door with a warmth that was unperformed and specific. "You'll want the east wing study for your work," Mrs. Finn said, leading her in. "It has the best light and a fireplace that actually draws. I've had a fire set. The Duke is away until Thursday, which means you'll have the accounts room to yourself." She said this with the particular approval of a woman who understands the value of working without being observed before one is ready to be observed. "Thank you," Penelope said. "I shall need the processing contracts as well, whenever they are available." "I'll fetch them myself," Mrs. Finn said. The first person at Claremore who had spoken to her with the understanding that she was there to do real work, and she had been there for approximately 7 minutes. Penelope had managed harder situations than this. She could manage this. The second person to receive her with anything approaching welcome was a retired diplomat named Sir Edward Prentice, who served the estate as an informal advisor on matters relating to its London business connections. He came to Claremore on the Friday of her first week, looked at what she had done with the wool processing analysis, asked 2 questions of such precise technical specificity that she understood he was testing her, answered both, and received in return the quiet nod of a man who has confirmed what he expected to confirm. The third quarter contracts, he said, have a renewal clause in subsection 4 that has never been exercised. I believe you will find it useful. She had found it in her first reading. She said so. He smiled, not with surprise but with the satisfaction of finding a professional equal. Good, he said, and poured them both tea, and they spent the following 2 hours going through the London wool merchant connections in sufficient detail that by the end of it, she had a complete picture of where the leverage actually lay. She had been at Claremore 11 days when Edmund returned from London. He arrived on a Thursday evening as Mrs. Finn had predicted, in a traveling coat and with the expression of a man completing an obligation. Penelope was in the East Wing study when she heard the doors. She continued working for another 20 minutes before going to find him, because she had 3 figures to verify before she lost her place. He was in the library when she arrived. He had removed his coat. She noticed it draped over the chair back, which struck her as the gesture of a man more at ease in this room than he had appeared in London, and he was looking at the fireplace with the particular quality of a person who is not looking at the fireplace. The room had 17 feet of shelving on the north wall, a worn rug in front of the fire, and a quality of dusty inhabitation that suggested it was used but not arranged. A music stand in the corner held a manuscript she had not been in to examine. "Your Grace," she said, "I have a preliminary analysis of the wool processing situation, if you have time." He turned. "You've been here 11 days. "Yes," she said. "The first quarter contract runs to the end of May. We should act on the renewal clause in the third quarter agreement before July. I can present the full analysis whenever you prefer. I have the figures complete." He looked at her with the measuring attention she recognized from the Hartley House reception. "Now, if you like," he said. She had brought the summary with her, because she had expected he might say that. She presented it, the processing timeline analysis, the market comparison across 6 years, the clause she and Sir Edward had identified, the revised schedule she proposed, and her conservative estimate of the recovered margin, £170 in year 1, rising to approximately £240 if the market held at current levels. She presented it the way she presented everything, organized, specific, without apology for the precision. Edmund listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The clause in subsection 4, Savage has been reviewing those contracts for 4 years. It requires reading subsection 4 on its own terms rather than as a modifier to subsection 2, she said. The syntax runs the wrong way for a quick reading. It is easy to pass over. You found it in 11 days. I found it in 3, she said. I spent the following 8 confirming that the market conditions made it worth exercising. He did not say anything further about it. He simply looked at the summary page for a long moment, then set it down carefully and said, "Thank you, Miss Ashworth. I would like to proceed with your recommendation." She went back to the East Wing study and sat at her desk for a moment before returning to work, pressing both hands flat on the surface of it, feeling the solidity of the wood. It was not gratitude, not quite. She had learned not to build things on expressions of approval, because approval had a habit of being revised when it became inconvenient, But it was something older and quieter than gratitude, the simple recognition of work accurately received. The opposition at Claremore assembled with the reliable efficiency of social machinery doing what it had been built to do. It had three faces. The first was Lady Caroline Voss, the eldest daughter of the Earl of Marlingham, who had been, by the general understanding of the county's titled families, the obvious candidate for the Duchess of Claremore. She was beautiful, precisely educated, and positioned. She arrived at Claremore in the second week of May for a dinner Edmund's father had arranged. The elder Cavendish, Lord Whitmore, had come down from the northern estate specifically for the purpose, and she moved through the dining room with the contained satisfaction of a woman reviewing territory she expects to occupy. She was wearing blue silk. She looked at Penelope, who was at the supper table in her role as the person who had confirmed the arrangement of the courses, and was now eating at the lower end of it, with the particular expression of a person who has identified an irregularity and is deciding whether to address it directly or allow it to resolve itself. She addressed it directly. At the end of the second course, in a moment when the table's conversation had divided into smaller exchanges, Lady Caroline said, across three place settings, "Miss Ashworth, I understand you have been brought in to manage some of the estate accounts. How very practical of the Duke." Penelope set down her fork. The estate accounts, the tenant farm agreements, the wool processing contracts, and the quarterly reporting to the London business connections, she said. "Yes." "How industrious," Lady Caroline said. The word carried exactly the weight she intended it to carry. "Accounts of 22 active agreements are not managed through industry alone," Penelope said. "They require a system. I built one at Marrow. I have adapted it here. The estate will recover approximately £170 in this financial year that it has been losing for 4 years. She picked up her fork and returned to her plate. "I find it satisfying work." The table had gone rather quiet. Edmund, at the head of it, had not spoken during this exchange, but she was aware, without looking at him directly, that he was entirely present in the particular way he was entirely present when he was paying close attention to something. Lord Whitmore, who was seated at Edmund's right, said nothing for the remainder of the course. He was a man of 63, with the upright carriage of someone who has spent his life in positions of authority and has not yet found reason to revise his assumptions. He had looked at Penelope when Edmund introduced her at the beginning of the evening with the expression of a man encountering a category problem. Not a servant, not a guest, not the expected candidate, not quite anything the available vocabulary covered satisfactorily. He came to find her the following morning. She was in the East Wing study when he arrived, without announcement, which told her that he had not gone through Mrs. Finn, which meant he did not want a record of the conversation. She stood when he entered, as was appropriate, and waited. "My son," Lord Whitmore said, "is a man of considerable standing. The expectations attached to his position are not, Miss Ashworth, matters of personal preference. They are structural." "I understand that," Penelope said. "You have been here 4 weeks. You have produced, by Mr. Savage's account, work of genuine quality. I do not dispute that. I am questioning whether this role," he paused, selecting his word, "requires you to be present here, in the way you currently are." Penelope looked at him with the careful attention of someone identifying the precise shape of an argument before responding to it. "The estate administrator role requires me to be present on the estate," she said. "The work cannot be done remotely. Lord Ashworth's arrangement at Marrow demonstrated that conclusively, in both directions." She paused one beat. "If you are asking whether my presence here is appropriate in terms broader than the professional arrangement, that is a question your lordship should address to His Grace, who made the arrangement with full knowledge of the circumstances." Lord Whitmore looked at her for a moment. "Not unkindly, exactly," but with the compressed acknowledgement of a man who has received an answer more precise than he expected. "You are not what I anticipated," he said, which was not a compliment but was not quite a dismissal either. He left. Penelope sat back down at her desk and returned to the third quarter contracts. Her hands were steady. She had managed a creditor negotiation at 19, alone, with no preparation beyond 4 days of arithmetic. She had managed an estate flood with no money, no authority, and no backup. She could manage Lord Whitmore. Edmund had appeared in the East Wing study doorway that same evening, without the formal approach that might have signaled this was a professional call. "My father spoke to you," he said. It was not a question. "He did," she said. "I am sorry for it." "He is not wrong," she said. "By the rules of your world, he is entirely correct." She looked up from the accounts. "I don't require an apology. I require that you not change your mind, because the situation is inconvenient." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I do not change my mind." He looked at the desk, at the spread of contracts and marked pages. "You have been working since before 7 this morning. The wool merchant is coming on Wednesday. I want the analysis finished." He crossed the room without particular announcement and looked at what she had on the desk. He stood close enough that she was aware of the specific warmth of another person in a cold-aired room. He said, "This clause you've marked. I would not have caught it in 10 readings." "The syntax goes backward," she said again. "Once you read it forward, it becomes plain." "Show me," he said. She showed him. She walked him through the clause the way she walked through any analysis, from first principles, in order, without assuming comprehension. He followed with the complete attention of a man who actually wants to understand, which was different from the attention of a man who wants to appear to understand, and she had learned to tell the difference years ago. By the end of it, he was leaning over the desk at an angle that brought him close enough that she could see, without trying, that his cravat was not quite correctly tied on the left side. It had been slightly off all evening. She had noticed it at supper without intending to notice it. She reached over and straightened it. It was done in approximately 2 seconds, without announcement, with the focused efficiency of someone correcting an error that has been visible for long enough. He went very still. "It has been crooked since supper," she said, without looking up from the contract page. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I know." She did look up then, and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Not surprise, something further along than surprise, something that had settled into a kind of careful attention she recognized, distantly, as the same expression Mr. Hargreave had worn when he looked at her accounts in 1810, the expression of someone who has seen something they were not expecting and are deciding what to do with it. She returned to the contract. He stayed in the study for another 40 minutes, reading the market comparison she had prepared, asking 2 questions, both of which required her to go back 3 pages to explain the underlying reasoning, and making no move to leave until Mrs. Finn appeared at the door to note that the fires in the rest of the house had been banked, and if His Grace intended to retire, now would be the time. After he left, Penelope sat at her desk for a moment, both hands on the surface of it. Then she picked up her pen and continued. The wool merchant meeting on Wednesday was the first of what became the significant professional theater of her first season at Clarenmore. His name was Mr. Alderton, and he arrived with the particular confidence of a man who has held the same market position for 8 years and expects to continue doing so. He had negotiated the previous 4 years of contracts with Edmund's dismissed stewards, and he had, each time, exercised the contract terms to his own advantage in ways that were technically correct and operationally disadvantageous to the estate. He had reviewed the third quarter agreement's renewal clause, he told Penelope when they sat down, and he was prepared to offer the same terms as the previous year. Penelope had the annotated contract in front of her, and Sir Edward's market comparison notes. and the 6-year pricing record she had compiled from the estate's own records and 3 independent sources Sir Edward had provided. She opened the annotated contract to subsection 4. "The renewal clause," she said, "entitles the estate to a rescheduled delivery window of up to 6 weeks, in either direction, at the administrator's election. We will be exercising that for the 3rd quarter, moving delivery forward by 4 weeks, to align processing with the August price point rather than the September one. The August average over the past 6 years is 11% above September. The contract terms apply to the revised window." Mr. Alderton looked at the clause. He looked at it for a long moment. "That clause has never been exercised," he said. "No," she said. "I am exercising it now." He made 3 separate attempts to renegotiate the terms over the following 2 hours, each one technically more sophisticated than the last, and each one received by Penelope with the same organized patience. She had the pricing data, the clause text, and the market comparisons arranged in the order in which she expected to need them, and she had expected all 3 attempts with reasonable precision. She was not angry. She was not performing confidence. She simply had more information than he did, and had organized it better, and that was the entire situation. Mr. Alderton signed the revised terms. He left with the expression of a man who has been bested by someone he had not adequately assessed, and who is still in the process of revising his model. Edmund had been in the estate office, not the negotiation room, during this meeting. She had told him in advance what she expected the outcome to be and what she intended to do, and he had said he trusted her judgment, which she had taken as straightforward professional information rather than sentiment. He came to find her afterward. "Alderton is a difficult negotiator," he said. "He is a prepared one," she said. "He simply was not prepared for the clause. Next year he will have read the whole contract." She paused. "As will I." Edmund looked at her for a moment. Then he did something she had not expected. He said, "Come and see the garden," not as an instruction but as the suggestion of a person who wants company and is not entirely comfortable saying so. It was almost dark, too late for gardens properly, but she put on her coat and went, because she had been inside since 7 that morning, and the east wing study had no window that opened. They walked the garden path without speaking much. He knew the estate the way someone knows a place they grew up in and have been away from, with the particular combination of familiarity and estrangement that comes from a long absence. He told her, at the south end of the path where the old kitchen garden wall ran, that his mother had kept this garden herself. Not the ornamental parts, those were managed, but this section, the walled part with the climbing roses and the old fig that had been there since before his memory. She had died when he was 24. He had been at Clarenmore very little since. Penelope did not offer condolence, which would have been wrong. She said she knew about gardens. She knew about everything quietly, he said, like you know about accounts. She looked at the fig tree in the near dark. It was a very old tree. It had the solid patience of things that have been growing for a long time in one place. "I found a manuscript in the library," she said, "on the music stand. I haven't opened it." He was quiet. "It was hers," he said. "A composition. She played every morning until she became ill." He paused. "I have not opened it either." She understood, then, the quality of the house's inhabitation. Maintained without being loved, because loving it without her had not been something he had known how to do. Like a well-built bridge over a gap he had been walking around for 14 years. She did not say this. She said, "It is a good fig tree." He looked at her sideways, and something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, something quieter, more structural than that, like a thing settling into place. "Yes," he said, "it is." The London business connections that had been attending the Clarenmore estate's affairs with peripheral interest became rather more attentive in late July, When word of the recovered wool processing margin reached the relevant circles through the medium of Mr. Alderton's revised autumn contracts, which had circulated among his own business connections with the speed that interesting financial information tends to travel, two of the Claremore Estate's London investors, men who had been patient with the annual processing loss without being entirely comfortable with it, sent letters requesting a meeting with Edmund and his new administrator. The meeting was held in London, at the offices of the legal firm that managed the London side of the estate's affairs, in the second week of August. Penelope had prepared for it with the same systematic specificity she brought to every meeting where someone was going to challenge something she had built. She had the complete accounts, the before and after comparison, the annotated contracts, and the 6-year market data Sir Edward had helped her source. She had everything organized in a leather portfolio she had purchased herself, because the estate's existing portfolio was too large and sent the wrong signal about how much paper was required to make her case. The two investors were men of 60 and 52 respectively, both with the careful, slightly skeptical attention of people who have made money by being slow to be impressed. They had been told by their joint correspondence with Edmund that Miss Ashworth would be presenting the estate's quarterly analysis. They had registered this information with the mild surprise of men who had anticipated a more conventional arrangement. Penelope presented. She began with the wool processing analysis because it was the most concrete evidence of what had changed, and she took them through it in the same order she had presented it to Edmund: the problem, the source, the clause, the revised schedule, the recovered margin. She showed them the before and after pricing comparison and the full 6 years of market data. She showed them the 3 creditor adjustments she had made in the estate's London accounts that had reduced the quarterly carrying costs by £22. She showed them the annotated tenant farm reassessment. She had done a full review of all 14 farms in her first 8 weeks and found that 3 had been underassessed relative to their actual productivity, which added £37 to the annual income. She did not argue or persuade. She presented. The figures spoke in the language of figures, which is the most authoritative language available to a person who has been told their voice carries no authority. The older investor, a Mr. Barlow, said, at the end of the presentation, the clause in the third quarter contract. Our own solicitors reviewed those contracts in 2013. 2013, Penelope said evenly, and corrected herself. In 1813. I know. The syntax runs against a quick reading. It is a genuine oversight, not a failure of attention. He looked at her for a long moment. The £22 in carrying cost reduction. Walk me through that again. She walked him through it. He asked one more question after that, and she answered it, and he sat back in his chair and looked at Edmund and said, with the measured honesty of a man recalibrating a position, "Where did you find her?" Edmund said, "She was managing an estate in Surrey for 11 years while my father's generation wasn't paying attention." Mr. Barlow looked at Penelope. His expression was not quite an apology. It was something more private than that. The small, private acknowledgement of a man who has understood something he should have understood earlier. "We would be glad," he said, "to receive quarterly reports of this quality." Edmund looked at her across the table and said nothing, but he held her gaze for one full moment, and in it was everything the situation had required her to earn, and everything she had earned, held without ceremony in the plain quiet of a professional room. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. That was in August. In September, the Claremore estate accounts were presented to the full investor group, 5 men, including Mr. Barlow and his associate, at the same London offices, and Penelope presented them again, with the third quarter's actual results, which had exceeded her conservative projection by £14, due to market conditions that had favored the advanced delivery window. She was halfway through the tenant farm section when the door opened and Lord Whitmore came in, which had not been arranged and which Edmund had clearly not expected. because he went very still in the way he went still when something required management. Lord Whitmore sat. He did not speak. He listened for 40 minutes while Penelope completed the presentation, answered Mr. Barlow's questions, answered the additional questions from the other 3 investors, and closed the portfolio. When the investors had received their copies of the summary and begun their discussion with Edmund, Lord Whitmore rose and came to stand beside Penelope near the window. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, not loudly, this was not for the room, "I reviewed the Marrow estate records. Mr. Savage provided me a copy." He paused. "The creditor agreements, the mill lease." "Yes," Penelope said. "You were 19 when you negotiated the first one." "Yes." He looked out the window at the street below. "I told my son," he said, "that the arrangement was structurally irregular." "I know. I was correct," he said. "I was also," he paused again, and the pause had the particular weight of a man selecting a word he is not in the habit of using. "Incomplete, in my assessment of the relevant factors." He looked at her directly. "My son makes sound decisions. He has always made sound decisions. It is a quality I have perhaps not credited sufficiently." He returned to his chair. He did not offer her anything else, and she did not require anything else. It was the acknowledgment of a man who has seen the evidence and adjusted his position accordingly. Not warmly, not easily, but honestly. That was enough. That was more than she had received from most people in 11 years. The formal inquiry, if it could be called that, though it was less structured than the legal sense of the term, came in October, and it came because Lady Caroline's father, the Earl of Marlingham, had raised with 3 members of Edmund's social circle the question of whether the Clarenmore estate's new administrative arrangement was consistent with the estate's established character. This was a delicate way of questioning whether a woman of Penelope's background, present in the capacity she occupied, was a disruption to what the estate represented socially, and the question had generated enough traction that Edmund had responded by inviting the relevant parties to Clarenmore for what he termed, in his correspondence, a review of the estate's annual accounts. It was held in the Manor's formal dining room, rearranged so that the long table served as a presentation surface. There were 9 people present: Edmund, Lord Whitmore, Mr. Barlow, the 2 other primary investors, 2 of Edmund's social peers who had been among those who had raised the question, and Lady Caroline herself, who had come with her father, the Earl. The Earl sat at one end of the table with the settled authority of a man who has orchestrated the occasion and expects to control its outcome. Penelope stood at the other end with the accounts portfolio, the annotated contracts, and Mr. Savage's 4-year comparative analysis, which she had asked him to prepare specifically for this occasion, documenting the estate's performance under the previous 4 years of stewards against the current year under her administration. She began with the numbers, because the numbers were the argument, and everything else was noise. She took the room through the wool processing recovery. £183 in year 1, already beating her projection by 13. She took them through the tenant farm reassessment, the creditor adjustment, the carrying cost reduction. She took them through Mr. Savage's comparative analysis, which showed, in the patient language of a professional with 31 years of experience, that the estate's administrative performance in the current year was the strongest it had been in a decade. She did not argue. She did not plead. She presented the documents and allowed them to say what they said, which was considerably more than she could have said by any other method. Lady Caroline, halfway through the tenant farm section, said, "These are very well organized figures." "Thank you," Penelope said, and continued. The Earl of Marlingham said, at the end, "The question before us is not whether the accounts are well managed. It is whether the arrangement is," he searched for his word, "appropriate," offered one of Edmund's peers. "Appropriate," the Earl confirmed. Edmund stood. He had been seated at the side of the table throughout. and he rose without the urgency of a man defending a position under attack, with the measured steadiness of a man who has already made his decision and is now making it visible. "Miss Ashworth," he said, looking at her at the other end of the table, "has managed this estate with a quality and precision I have not found in 4 previous attempts to solve the same problems. She identified a contract clause my solicitors missed. She recovered a loss that has been running for 4 years. She did this in 11 days. He looked at the Earl. "The question of appropriateness has a straightforward answer. I intend to ask Miss Ashworth to marry me. I am informing this room of that intention because I believe the people in it deserve to know that the situation will be resolved in the most permanent and direct way available to me, and because Miss Ashworth deserves to have that intention stated in front of witnesses." The room did not erupt. There was a long, suspended moment in which 9 people processed 9 different versions of what had just happened. Penelope stood at the end of the table with the accounts portfolio in her hands. She looked at Edmund with the particular stillness of someone receiving information of considerable weight and holding it steady rather than dropping it. She knew this was a public statement of intent, not a proposal. It required no answer from her here, in this room, in front of these people. Edmund crossed the length of the table and stood before her and took her hand. Her ungloved hand. She had removed her gloves to turn the account pages, and pressed it, once, deliberately. It was the gesture of a man who has chosen not the convenient thing but the true thing, in a room full of people who will remember it. Lady Caroline looked at the table. Not defeated, she was too composed for that, but with the private recognition of a woman who has understood that the situation has been resolved by means outside her available response. She looked at the account documents spread before her and said nothing further. Lord Whitmore, at Edmund's shoulder, looked at Penelope with the expression of a man completing a calculation. He gave one small, precise nod. Not approval exactly, but acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a man who has understood what he was looking at. The room changed. Not dramatically. It was not that kind of room. It settled, the way a thing settles when the weight in it has been correctly distributed at last. Edmund came to find her 3 days later, not in the East Wing study, at the kitchen garden wall, in the evening, where the old fig tree was going gold with the season. She had gone there at the end of the day, because it was the one place at Claremore that felt, without her having chosen it, like a place she had already been given. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking, which was characteristic of him. He did not fill silence with noise, one of the things she had come to depend on without naming it as dependence. "I made a statement in a room full of people last Tuesday," he said. "That was true, and was necessary, and was not the thing I actually wanted to say." She looked at the fig tree. "What I wanted to say," he said, "was not suited to that room." He was quiet for a moment, not because it was convenient or appropriate, or fitted the requirements my position imposes, but because you are the most capable person I have ever encountered, and you are also the person I want to watch figure out problems for the rest of my life. And you fixed my cravat in September without stopping your sentence, which I have thought about considerably more often than is strictly professional." She pressed one hand briefly against the garden wall. The stone was warm from the day's sun, solid and specific under her palm. "You said in London," she said, "that you do not change your mind." "I do not," he said. "Then neither do I," she said. She let her hand drop from the wall and looked at him directly. "Yes." He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of everything he did not say aloud, the particular quality of a man who has organized himself around restraint for a long time, and is learning, carefully, to let something through. He took her hand, bare again. She had not bothered with gloves for the garden. "I will read you the marriage contract clause by clause," he said. "You will find at least one thing to renegotiate. Subsection 4, she said. He almost smiled. It was quieter than a smile. Something structural, something settled. Subsection 4, he agreed. They married in December, in the parish church adjacent to the estate, with Lord Whitmore present and Mr. Savage as a witness, and Mrs. Finn in the second row wearing her Sunday coat and holding a handkerchief she did not need to use, but held as a precaution. Sir Edward Prentice gave the address, which was short and precise, and contained one sentence that made Edmund's jaw tighten slightly in the controlled way it tightened when he was moved, and did not intend to show it. Lady Caroline had sent a formal note of congratulation that was correct in every respect. Penelope had received it, noted that it was correctly done, and put it in the correspondence file. Lord Whitmore came to the kitchen garden the following spring, on a visit that coincided with the fig tree's first budding. He stood in front of it for a long moment without speaking. Then he said to no one in particular, "My wife used to bring cuttings from this." He left shortly after, without requiring a response, and Penelope recorded in her private notebook that the tree would need a support structure for the northern branch by autumn. Their daughter Eleanor Margaret Cavendish arrived in the autumn of 1817, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's expression of complete assessment when encountering anything new. She learned to walk along the kitchen garden wall, steadying herself against the old stone, and her first observed action of independent competence, noted by Mrs. Finn, who took these things seriously, was the rearrangement of a set of objects on the morning-room table in an order that was, on examination, chronological. Penelope's administration of the Claremore estate produced, in the first 3 years, a set of annotated accounts that Mr. Savage distributed, with Edmund's permission, to 4 neighboring estates whose administrators came to him with the same processing loss problem she had solved in her first week. The documents became a practical template for wool processing account management in that part of the county, used by 6 estates within 5 years, never under her name, because that was still not how such things worked, but with a notation, in Mr. Savage's covering letter, that the system had been developed by the Claremore estate administrator, and that inquiries could be directed to Claremore accordingly. The inquiries came. She answered them. By the winter of 1820, she was corresponding with 12 estate administrators on questions of account structure, contract negotiation, and the particular problems of market timing in agricultural processing. She did not have a title for this work. It did not require one. The work was real, and it was done, and it produced results that the people receiving it could measure, which was always the only measurement that had mattered to her. Edmund found her at the writing desk on a February evening, the East Wing study, always the East Wing study, with the fire that drew and the window that caught the morning light, and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her work through a letter from an administrator in Wiltshire, who had found what appeared to be a 3-year systemic underassessment in his tenant farms. She had her pen in one hand and Eleanor, who had escaped the nursery, on her hip with the other, managing both with the organized efficiency she brought to everything she managed. "She has your filing system," Edmund said. Penelope looked down at Eleanor, who was engaged with a sheet of blank paper, folding it with great intent. "She has better fingers for it," she said. He crossed the room and lifted Eleanor from her hip, and the child settled against his shoulder with the complete confidence of someone accustomed to being held reliably. He looked over Penelope's head at the letter she was writing. "Wiltshire," he said. 3 years of underassessment, the same measurement error as the eastern farms at Marrow. There is a surveying practice in the region that appears to use an outdated standard," she continued writing. "I am sending them the Marrow documentation. It solved itself in 1 letter last time." Edmund was quiet for a moment. Eleanor put her folded paper against his shoulder and regarded it with satisfaction. "You were managing this," he said, "at 17, before anyone thought to ask you." At 17, I was learning it, she said. At 19, I was managing it. She completed her sentence and set the pen down. There is a difference. He looked at her with the expression she knew completely now. The quiet, structural attention of a man who has been watching the same person for years and does not intend to stop. She knew he was watching. She had always known when Edmund was watching, the same way she had always known the state of every room she had ever been responsible for, because she paid attention, and because some things, once known, stay known. She sealed the letter, set it on the pile for the Morning Post, and reached up to straighten his cravat, which was not crooked. She straightened it anyway. He stood very still in the particular way he stood very still when she touched him, holding Eleanor, and looking at her with everything he had given up performing and nothing he had given up feeling. Outside, the February evening had gone quiet and blue. The kitchen garden wall was there in the dark, solid and specific, the fig tree leafless and patient against the stone. Come spring it would bud again. It always did.